program are solely that of Jung's Garden Center, not WBEV or Good Karma brands. Let's give it to Thomas Reinfeld and the Garden Doctor.
Thank you so much, L.A., and welcome to the third edition of the Springtime Season 2023 for the Garden Doctor. We are joined again with Dick Zondag from Jung's Garden Center. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I have to ask, I noticed that the fingernail's still a little dirty today, so what were we planting in the greenhouse?
Still working on hanging baskets and some of the tomatoes and things like that we're going to be sending south. So they got to be started a little bit earlier. They're going to probably be hitting the mail in another week or two. So yeah, the greenhouses are plump full, and we're still pushing stuff out. So yeah.
So do you grow, is it just tomatoes or multiple plants for out-of-state nurseries or growers?
No, we grow a lot of tomato, grafted tomato and pepper plants and eggplants and regular seedlings for our customers, for our consumers, and they're sent out in a size that's ready to put in the garden, so you don't have to start them, and you can get the varieties that you want.
Making it easy. I mean, there's a lot of different options. People can start their seeds indoors, and we can talk about that a little bit more, of course.
Sure. If
you have any questions for the Garden Doctor, 885-4446 if you prefer to call it in. However, we do have the text line up, ready to go, 887-9595. And last week we were focusing on mulching,
right,
and what we can and cannot put in our mulch. And when it comes to what we can include, I noticed that there are some things, like some lessons you mentioned of fresh grass clippings you want to avoid. You want to make sure those are composted. But what about like other things we may find, like pine needles or hay?
Pine needles are very good mulch for your annual plantings, because they don't break down very easily, and they do what a mulch should do. Grass clippings do make a good mulch for a garden if they're put on thin enough. You don't want to use them in your compost pile unless you mix other organic matter with them, because they tend to get a little bit slimy. But in a mulching situation where you're just putting a thin layer of grass clippings on, like your tomato plants or your peppers or your eggplants, the grass makes a really great mulch only if you haven't used any broadleaf weed killers in them. So if you're using a weed and feed, you don't want to use those grass clippings in your garden, because they'll also take your vegetable plants out, because the broadleaf weed killer is meant to kill any broadleaf plant, not just the weeds in your lawn. So if you're just fertilizing your lawn and getting it growing, and you're getting the grass clippings off there, they're legal to use as a mulch in your garden. In fact, it makes a great mulch in the garden.
What are some of the other mulches we would want to use before? Straw? Would straw be preferable?
Straw is a good mulch. Hay makes a good mulch. Ground corn cobs, compost. If you've composted the material and it's broken down, compost makes an excellent mulch too. And the reason you use a mulch is that it keeps the moisture in after you get a rain. It suppresses the weed growth underneath. If you cover the soil with the mulch, it keeps the weeds down a little bit. And if it's an organic mulch, it also adds organic matter to the soil, because that organic mulch will break down eventually, and you just work it into the soil, and it works very, very well.
In the case of pine needles, because you did mention that they are difficult to break down, they have that waxy coating. For some of those materials that we can mulch, do we want to grind them up, or do we want them to decompose naturally?
If you're going to compost the different organic matter, the grass clippings or the leaves in the fall, it's a good idea to run them through your mower, or to get a compost shredder. Because there'll be more surface area for the microorganisms that do the decomposition to work on. Pine needles are even difficult to compost in a compost pile, because they have a lot of cellulose and a lot of things that it takes a long time to break down, and that's why they make a good mulch if you're using it in a shrub border or something where, or a perennial border where you're not going to be working the mulch into the ground. But in most cases, they use a mulch that will break down over time, and then it just makes the soil much richer underneath and puts more organic matter in the soil, so it holds the minerals a lot better.
If you have a question for the garden doctor, 887-9595 is our text line, 885-4446. We had a couple of questions. One of them was about this white carpet that is over their yard. What can they do about it? Just let it melt. And the second question was about moss in a driveway. If somebody can use like preen on weeds now, or if they should be using it.
Well, preen is a germination inhibitor, and the seeds are not germinating right now, and so if you put preen on right now, preen lasts about 6 to 8 weeks as far as the effectiveness of the herbicide, and if you put it on now, by the time you get to the middle of May, the first part of June, it's going to be gone. So you want to use preen probably when the soil temperature gets about 55 degrees. So that would probably be about when the forsythia are in bloom, and that's when you would apply preen. And what I always recommend, especially if you've not used it before, is to treat an area with the preen and leave an area where you don't treat, and then you can see the difference, because preen does not get 100% of the weeds. It'll get probably 85 to 90% of the weeds, but a lot of people will put preen on and they'll say, well, that didn't work any good, I still have weeds. Well, if you hadn't put preen on, you'd probably have 10 times as many weeds. And so it's always good to leave a check where you're not treating to make sure that the herbicide that you're using is effective. And the same thing with your crabgrass preventer that you put on in the springtime. You want to put that on when the forsythia is in bloom, because if you put it on before, that again has a 6 to 8 week shelf life once it's applied to the soil. And if you put it on too early, a lot of the effectiveness of that herbicide will be gone by the time the crabgrass is germinating.
And what about for moss? What would be sprayable?
There are moss controllers. Moss is usually where the pH of the soil is quite low, where it's very acidic, and so in a driveway situation, I guess I would just scrape it off and maybe use a pressure washer to get rid of it. Or you can use a mixture of 10 parts water, 1 part Clorox or bleach, and that also does sterilize and takes care of the moss. But a good washing with a pressure washer will take a lot of that moss and wash it away.
You have a question for the garden doctor, 885-4446. Some of the things that we can be doing right now, obviously we have a fresh blanket of snow. What are some of the tips that we can be doing right
There's
now?
not a lot you can do outside when there's snow, but you can start raking your lawn, getting that thatch out of the lawn, and if you have bare spots in your lawn, or you want to make your lawn thicker, you can actually apply the grass seed right now, because it will not germinate as long as the soil is cold, but it's there when the soil temperature is proper for the seed to germinate. It's kind of like crabgrass. It waits until the temperature of the soil is around 55 to 60 degrees, and then it germinates. And so if you've got your lawn grass on the surface of the lawn, when the soil temperature gets to the proper time, it will germinate and will come up much faster.
Do you have soil thermometers at John's?
Yes, we do. Yeah. What you do is you stick the thermometer in the ground about 6 inches, and that's where you want to measure the temperature, so that you know that once it reaches that temperature down 6 inches, it means that the soil temperature is going to stay above that, even if we get cold snaps, because there's enough energy stored in the ground then to keep the soil at the temperature where plants will germinate, or the seed will germinate.
So if we are starting any seeds indoors at this time, what would we be starting?
It's getting towards the time when petunias and impatiens and some of the flower seeds should have been started, but you can still start them, and they'll be a little bit later, but there again, keep a good notebook on when you start things. Some of the harder to germinate vegetable seeds like eggplant and peppers can be started now. I would wait another week or two for tomatoes and the cole crops like cabbage and cauliflower and broccoli and Brussels sprouts. A little bit early for them because they germinate quite rapidly, and they'll probably get pretty leggy if you start them right now for our temperature, especially if we get a cold snap and temperatures are lower. Some of the things that you can do for your garden, we do have the seed potatoes available now in garden centers and through the mail, and with them, if you want to make more than, planting the whole potato, you want to cut the pieces up about a week to 10 days before you plant them, and that way you let them sit out in the warm temperature, and they'll grow callus tissue over the cut surface, so that when you plant the potatoes, if it does get cold and rainy and not real great growing conditions, the potato pieces won't rot in the ground. There'll be a layer of protection, and so they'll work really well. A lot of people are now starting their potatoes right on the surface of the soil and covering them with hay and straw, because and then the buds, the shoots will come up through that, and the potatoes will grow in the straw and in the hay, and you'll get a nice crop of potatoes that you don't have to dig, because the potatoes basically will not form any lower than where they were when they were planted. So even if you've got a soil and you want to plant them an inch or two deep in the soil and then cover them with the hay or straw, that works really well, because you want to keep the potatoes as they're growing from getting sunlight on them, because if you do, the potatoes are actually a tuber, a piece of stem tissue that if they're hit with light, they will form chlorophyll. And if you've got a green potato, you don't want to eat it because it has some pretty nasty chemicals in it. But as long as you keep those potatoes covered, and that's why you hill up potatoes if you're growing them in soil, so that the tubers, as they're formed, will be covered with soil and they will not turn green on you.
Do you recommend mounding around the potato chunk that we plant in?
Yeah, definitely. You want to, as the tops of the potatoes grow, you want to mound the soil up around them, and that's why 6 or 8 or 10 inches of hay or straw over those buds as they're growing, and then pulling them in as the tops grow. Will keep the potatoes from being exposed to the sunlight.
Is that a trick that we should be applying to most of the plants that we have in our garden, of building up the soil around them as they continue to grow?
No, not really. You want to keep the soil away from the tomato plants. I guess the big thing with tomatoes now is to train them up, either to put them on a chain link fence or on a stake of some sort or another, and then keep the suckers on the bottom 12 inches removed, and the foliage too, because it keeps the soil splashing up onto the leaves from when it rains, keeps it from getting disease quite a bit. So if the tomatoes are on the ground and there's leaves and you don't train them up, they become more susceptible to the early blight. So you want to train them up, tie them up on some kind of a structure or on a post, and then keep the first few suckers that come out trimmed off, so that the tomatoes are earlier and they will be more prolific that way.
And you've mentioned again how raised beds and container gardening are so great for tomatoes. I have a couple questions about that, but going back to starting seeds inside, if we are germinating seeds inside. I've heard that you can use paper towel, maybe an old piece of T-shirt, and soak it in water and just roll your seeds there. Where do you want to keep them then to make sure that they're warm enough?
When you're starting them that way, you've got to take them off from that paper toweling or the cloth that you're starting them on almost immediately after they start to throw that small leaflet or that small root out, because you don't want them rooting down into the paper or into the cloth material. So what you'd do then is you'd have a pot or a Jiffy 7 or something ready to go. And with tomatoes and some of the seeds, if you do them in that type of an environment where you keep them warm and you put them in a paper towel or in a cloth, I would say probably in 3 to 5 days you're going to be putting them into soil, because you don't want them to get too large outside of the medium that they're going to be growing in. Otherwise, they have a tough time when you transfer them from the paper toweling to the soil mix. So usually we recommend paper toweling for testing the seeds, and then starting them in a peat soil so that they are started in a mixture that doesn't contain garden soil, because garden soil will create problems with damping off if the moisture isn't controlled properly.
So peat moss is a better starting substrate because it controls that moisture a little bit more?
Well, because the plants can grow in it, and they can come up and they can get 2 or 3 sets of true leaves before you have to transplant them. Where if you start them in toweling, then you're going to have to transfer the seedling. Once that little radical, the small root comes out of the seed coat, you've got to get them into a soil mix, because if they root down into the paper toweling or into the cloth, you're going to be ripping some of the roots when you try to get them into the soil. So it's better to use a peat-based potting soil or a peat-based seed starting soil for starting your plants.
So if we were heading down to Jones this weekend, we picked up some tomato seeds, and we're going to be seeding them inside, how long are we going to have them inside? When are we going to put them outside to harden, and then when would we plant them in the garden?
Okay, usually about mid-May is when the danger of frost is gone. So with tomatoes and the cole crops, 6 weeks ahead of time, so we're getting close to that time. And if you're going to be growing them in a larger pot where you want a larger plant, then you can start them now. And instead of using a 2 1/4 inch pot, maybe you want a 3-inch pot. And then you want to get them into plenty of light, and you want to have a cool temperature. Most houses now run in the high 60s, low 70s, and that's a good temperature for growing them. And then you don't want to over-fertilize them, because if you do, they tend to stretch, and you'll get leggy plants, which is not impossible to get going in the garden, but it's better if you get a real nice stocky tomato plant or pepper plant or whatever.
So leave the legs to the humans. You don't want them on the tomato plants at all.
No.
If you have a question for the garden doctor, our text line and our phone lines are both open, 887-9595 if you have a text, 885-4446 if you have a call question for the garden doctor. Dick Zondag from Jones Garden Center. Talking a little bit more about raised beds, I was mentioning that there's a lot of different options for container planting. Really, the only limit is your imagination when it comes to what you can plant, a tomato plant, for instance, into.
Sure, and what you can use for a raised bed garden too. I mean, the ones that I've just done and the ones that we have a video on, raised bed gardens on our website, there's a clickable field that you can go to, and we built some raised beds last fall, and then I built a couple more this winter that we'll be putting out this spring. But what I did was I got some extra, I don't know if they were rejects or they came back from a job, but I bought some corrugated steel, and they were 30-inch corrugated steel, and I cut them in half with a saw, and then attached them to a framework and made a 6 by 12 raised bed garden that I'm going to be planting this spring. I did some last fall, and half of it is in chives right now, and I planted some onion seeds in the fall. I'm going to see whether that works or not. I know a lot of people have told me that if you can plant the seed in the fall, they'll come up in the springtime. We'll see. But raised bed gardening, you have to have a good soil in a raised bed garden. You can't just fill it up with garden soil because the garden soil is too heavy. The best media that I've used so far is a third sand, a third peat moss, and then or a third perlite, a third peat moss, and a third different mixes of compost, whether you use mushroom, leaf compost, cow manure, chicken manure. You mix it together in equal quantities, and then you put it in the raised bed. Now, the raised bed that I made is 15 inches high. I filled the bottom 9 inches with wood chips that I got from one of the companies that in Randolph that does tree trimming, and they shred up the branches and things like that. So I got a couple of loads of that, and I filled the bottom half of it with those wood chips. And then on top of that, I put this mixture that I'm going to be growing the plants in, because the plants only need about 6 to 8 inches of soil to grow, and that's where most of the root activity is. And so by filling the bottom with those wood chips, it saves a little money on filling those raised beds. But raised beds are becoming very popular, and you can grow a lot of things much closer together in a raised bed because you've got a very high nutritious soil, and by adding compost each spring before you do your planting, it brings the nutrients back up to the level, and it replaces the nutrients that the vegetables have taken out. So I'm going to be growing most of I'm going to have both in-ground and raised bed gardens, because we're going to be doing a lot of videos. I'm starting a whole series of videos on YouTube. The Garden Doctor channel is what the area that I'm going to be putting these videos in, but you can get at them from the Jung Facebook page too. And so we did one on begonias this week, and we're going to do a couple more tomorrow, and as things come up, we're going to be doing them. And so one of them is going to be planting the raised bed gardens, and how you do it, and how you train the plants, the different types of trellises that you can use to train your peas or your vine crops on. So there's going to be a lot of information in those videos that we're getting a little late start on, and there seems to be a lot of them on YouTube right now, but we're going to try to have our own.
Everybody's fantasizing about just getting in the garden already. So
yeah.
When it comes to the raised bed, you have these 9 inches of wood chips. If somebody doesn't have access to that, could you just lay a layer of sticks in the base of it?
Sticks, or some people actually, it's called hugelkultur, where they get logs and put them in the bottom.
Yeah.
And the logs will break down. But I think if you contact any of the people that do tree trimming in your area, they'd gladly bring wood chips to you, because they're always looking for places to drop them, because even the power company, when they're trimming the branches off the power lines and things like that, they come up with a lot of those, and they're usually willing to bring them right to your area, right to your lawn. Drop them off.
It's a great way. I was just picking up sticks in the yard over the weekend, and it was, what do I do with these? I don't have a shredder. I can't chop them up into sawdust, but that's a great idea. If you have a raised bed, just line them up on the bottom.
Yep, that works really well. And they break down as the time goes by, because the nutrients leach out of the tops part of the raised bed, and they'll work on the wood chips that are below, and the depth goes down every year, and you just fill that up with compost and work it into the top couple of inches and start planting.
You have a question for the garden doctor, 885-4446, 887-9595. And going back to the question about raised beds and container gardening, we were talking a little bit about hanging baskets for tomato plants, and you said it's actually pretty easy to do.
Yeah, there are baskets where you can actually put the tomato plant upside down in the bottom and bring the bottom of the tomato out the bottom, and then as that tomato grows, because the branches on plants tend to go upward, not horizontal or down, the tomato actually comes out the bottom of the pot and then kind of turns up and actually will cover the basket that it's put in. I don't know if we have any of those in the garden center, but I've seen them. And they do really, really well. But you can also plant tomatoes in a hanging basket or in a container. If you've got a smaller container or a smaller hanging basket, like you've got less than a 5-gallon or less container, probably want to use the determinate type tomatoes that don't just keep growing and growing and growing. Yeah, determinate, because of the size of the tomato plant is determined by the variety that you plant, and it usually gets, I don't know, 2 to 3 feet high, and then it stops and produces its crop. And so they're usually called patio tomatoes, but the seed packets or the description should tell you whether it's determinate or indeterminate. If you plant an indeterminate tomato plant, that means that the vine will keep growing as long as it's in an environment that it will grow. And so, I've seen tomato vines that were 10 feet tall because they over-fertilized them with nitrogen, which made them really, really grow. But the determinate tomatoes are for containers or for cages. If you're planting a tomato in a cage, the determinate tomatoes are the best thing to use, because usually if it's a 6 foot or less height, an indeterminate tomato will outgrow the cage and become a problem unless you trim it back, unless you trim the top of it. So if you're going to use cages, the determinate tomatoes are the ones to use, and if you're going to grow an indeterminate variety, those are the ones you want to train either on a trellis or on a fence, or, if you go on YouTube, there are just multiple videos on how to train them. The Florida weave is one of the things that we're going to demonstrate on a video that I'll be doing this summer, and we're going to be using cattle fencing to train them on. So there's a lot of, imagination is the word of the day as far as training tomatoes.
Well, excellent. I have a couple of follow-up questions about that, but let's go to the phones right now. 885-4446 is our number, and say good morning, caller. What's your question for the garden doctor?
Yes, I live in the country, and we have a lot of black walnut trees. I cannot grow a garden. Just give up on it and buy everything from the Amish, or what?
Black walnuts are a real problem with the garden. There are very few vegetables that can be grown under a walnut tree or even within 25 feet of a walnut tree. And it probably isn't going to help to cut it down and get rid of it, because the roots will, while they're breaking down, will exude this naturally occurring herbicide. You've got to have an area where you're away from the black walnuts. They make beautiful trees and beautiful wood, but for a garden, especially a garden, there are virtually no vegetables that will grow in the shade of a walnut tree.
Well, thank you so much for that question. Are there other plants like black walnut that are not companions for our garden, or that we want to avoid?
Anything in that walnut family, butternut, black walnuts, pecans, they produce a naturally occurring herbicide called juglone, and it kills next to everything. Although we do have a pamphlet that we've written on things that will survive under a black walnut tree, and things like bleeding hearts and lily of the valley, and there are a few things. Hostas, I think, will work under under a walnut tree, but for the most part, that herbicide that it exudes from the leaves or from the roots will, if not kill the plant, will make it very sick.
If you have a question for the garden doctor, 885-4446. Dick Zondag from Young Garden Centers. And going back to tomatoes, determinate, indeterminate plants, if we have an indeterminate plant, we need to train it if we're going to be putting it on a trellis or something where it can climb. Determinate tomatoes, good for cages. What variety do we want to use for the raised bed, or I guess the hanging basket variety?
I think determinate would be what I would use for the hanging basket, because they're going to, I mean, if you use an indeterminate, they're going to just keep growing and growing and growing. In the raised bed, I think you can use either one, depending on what you're going to do on. You know, with the indeterminate tomatoes, I know when I was younger and up until maybe 10 years ago when we acquired the Totally Tomatoes catalog, we used to just grow them on the ground, and they just kind of sprawl and they spread out, and they root out wherever they touch the ground. And pretty much the middle of August, the beginning of September, your tomatoes were pretty much done, because they were, the vines were dead from early blight. But getting them up off the ground and getting them trained on something will keep them alive pretty much until the cold weather takes them out. Now, there are some diseases that you have to be really careful of. The early blight is one that you can spray for. There are fungicides that you can use on it when you get it. There's a disease called late blight, which we don't have a whole lot of trouble with in Wisconsin, but a couple of years ago there was an outbreak of late blight, and late blight will kill a tomato vine in less than a week. Once they get it, it's just goes through the plant like fire and takes them out, and there's really nothing you can do about late blight. It's a disease that will kill the plant. So
raised beds, not only keeping our tomatoes disease-free, but also increasing the amount of time we can maybe harvest fruit from them as well.
Yep. Raised bed gardens, the soil is a lot more fertile, and so you get a much bigger production out of them. One other thing that we sell with that you can use with tomatoes is the grafted tomatoes. A lot of the heirloom varieties are very susceptible to early and late blight of the tomato, and they're also very susceptible to some of the wilting diseases that they get in the soil. And so what they do is they have a tomato variety. It's a species tomato. It's not one that you would ever grow for the fruit, but it's one that's very tolerant or very immune to the diseases that are in the soil. And so what they do is they graft the heirloom variety onto this rootstock, and then as long as you plant it so that the graft is above ground and you keep the plant from touching the ground, that plant will be much more productive, sometimes 2 to 3 times the amount of fruit you get from a regular seedling. The problem with just letting them grow is wherever they touch the ground, they root, and that root will become a portal for getting the disease into the plant. So with the hybrid, or with the grafted tomatoes, you have to train them up off the ground, or just plant a seedling tomato, because they'll be as diseased as a seedling will be. But the grafted tomatoes have become quite popular because they are so much more productive, especially with the heirloom varieties, the Brandywines, there's a whole bunch of them, Mortgage Lifter, Purple Cherokee. There are a lot of heirloom varieties that we have listed in the catalog, and they do much better on a graft. But you have to keep that graft union above ground, and you have to keep the plant from touching the ground. So,
Dick, when our tomatoes are entering the fruiting stage, what is your philosophy with defoliation or removing the leaves of the tomato to maybe put more energy into the fruits?
You do that at the beginning of when you're starting the tomatoes, because the tomatoes tend to put more energy into those lower suckers when they're starting out. And by removing the suckers and the bottom leaves, it encourages the plant to grow and to start fruiting earlier. It's not putting as much energy into making the foliage. And so if you just let a tomato plant grow and you leave the bottom leaves on, it tends to put more energy into growing a bigger plant than producing the fruit. And a lot of times you'll see fruit clusters, the flower clusters on the stems quite low to the ground, and those tend to abort if the bottom leaves and the suckers aren't taken out, where if you take them out, those flowers become more visible to the bees that do the pollinating, and they will produce fruit much earlier if you do some pruning back early in their life cycle.
If we're starting some herb gardens, would this be the right time to start some of those seeds indoors?
Yes, the herbs should be started right now because they take a little bit longer to grow. The basil and rosemary and thyme, and some of them are grown from cuttings, so those can be purchased at the store. But the seedling ones, they should be started right away and then transplanted when the danger of frost is gone.
I have a question for the garden doctor. As we come down to the last 8 minutes or so, we can still take your question, 885-4446. Of course, the text line open, 887-9595. Dick, what are these that you brought in here today?
Okay, well, I brought some coral bells along. They've been really hybridized backwards and forwards, and so, there used to be there was just a green, beautiful green plant, but now we've got yellow and we've got purple and we've got variegated leaves, and there are some that are light red and some that are dark red, and there are some that are almost an iridescent purple, and they grow very well. They're quite hardy. They make very nice mounded plants in the front of a border or in a rock garden. They're really pretty. There are some that get quite large. Palis Purple was an All-American back maybe 20 years ago. It was one of the first purple-leafed varieties, but these plants you plant more for the foliage color than you do for the flowers, although the flowers are quite refined, and there are just a ton of new coral bells coming on the market, and so I thought I'd bring a few of them along so we could see the different colors. But we are shipping these
I love this purple.
green plants to the southern states. It's too early to plant plants like this that are in full bloom or in full leaf out because of the cold weather. But in another month or month and a half, these will all be available. We'll talk a little bit about bare root too. A lot of people want to know when they can plant bare root, and the rule of thumb is when the frost is out of the ground and the excess moisture has moved through, so that you're not mudding things in, time to get the bare root out. Now, we'll be opening our bare root room the 31st of March, so that's when the bare roots will be available. And actually, if you want to get certain things that we run out of every year, the peaches or some of the cherries and some of the things, it's probably a good idea to come in right away and get them. You can hold them in a cool garage for probably 2 to 3 weeks before they have to be planted. They're wrapped in a plastic-coated paper, and you can just keep the roots moist until it's time to plant, and then a day before you plant them, you put them in a bucket of water with root stimulator in them, and then you get the hole ready to go. The soil that you take out of the hole, you should use at least half of that native soil, but then if you've got a clay soil, or if you've got a soil that needs to be amended, you want to mix the compost or the peat moss with the soil that you put back around the root system. You don't want to just put that great soil around the root system. You got to have some of the native soil, so when they hit the interface between the hole and the pot that you created in the ground, the roots will keep going out And it's good to get them in early because as long as it's cool outside, the top won't break in. But as long as the soil is warm, the roots will start to grow. So that plant will establish the root system before the tops break in. And so I would say anytime, usually you can tell it's time to plant when the farmers are starting to turn the soil over to plant oats. That's when the time to plant your bare root stuff is. And then, like I said, we've got potatoes, we've got begonias and dahlias and onions available now. Onions will stand a little bit of frost, so they can be planted early. If you want the really big onions, you want to fertilize them when you plant them, and then keep fertilizing them, keep the weeds out of them, and they'll do really well for you. So, you know, we've got a lot of good things available now in the garden centers. Our seed selection is unexcelled in the state of Wisconsin, and you know, we've got garden centers now in 7 different communities. So we've got 3 in the Madison area, the 1 in Sun Prairie, Randolph, Stoughton, Stevens Point, and Appleton now. So we're spreading our wings a little bit with the retail stores. So if you're in those areas, the potatoes are there now, and so get them cut up so you have 2 or 3 eyes per piece, and let them out in the warm room so they callus over. And then I'm not sure if Good Friday is going to be too early this year, but a lot of people plant their potatoes on Good Friday. But I think that's like the 7th of April. That's a little early for that, but it's good to get them in the ground early because then they get off to a good start, and you'll have a great potato crop in the fall.
Well, I know we have a caller on the line, but we are coming down to the last couple of minutes. So, caller, if you do have a quick question, let's go over to the phone and say, good morning. What is your question for the garden doctor?
Last year I had a real healthy tomato plants, about 3 or 4 feet tall.
Okay.
And I went away up north for about 2-3 days and came back, and all of a sudden my tomato plants looked like a bare naked maple tree.
Yeah.
So I went out there and I found a 5/8-inch slug, or not slug, but caterpillar type.
Yeah.
It was green with a horn coming out of its rear
Yeah,
end.
those are the tomato horn rim, and they're a caterpillar, and they are very voracious feeders.
Just
And so,
decimated my plants.
you know, as soon as you see some of the leaves starting to be eaten, it's a good idea to get out there with an insecticide. 7 is a great one. We have a potato-tomato dust that works really well.
Okay.
Probably a good idea in midsummer to give them a good treatment of that to make sure that the insects that are there will be taken care of. But those worms are very hungry, and they'll take a lot of foliage off the plants. A lot of people will take a can of kerosene and kind of flick them into the can of kerosene.
Oh, yeah.
Takes them out, so.
Well, thank you so much for that question, and that will do it for today's Garden Doctor. Dick, what are the hours for Jones Garden Center?
Okay, the hours, I better read them. We're starting with our spring hours on the 27th of March. Randolph store hours are 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, 9 to 4 on Saturday. The other garden centers, which I named a little earlier, 10 to 5 Monday through Friday, 10 to 4 on Saturday and Sunday. So Randolph, we're not open on Sunday, but the other stores we are.
And check out the Garden Doctor channel on YouTube. Lots of videos coming, including for those raised beds. Also, how to train your peas.
Yep.
Hopefully they'll sit and stay this year. Well, next week, episode 4 of the Garden Doctor right here on 95.3 WBAV. Thank you so much, Dick. That will do it. And the following was a paid program. The views and opinions expressed are solely at Jones Garden Center, not WBAV, ESPN, nor Good Karma Brands.